that was here for that was posed during Dave's presentation. And how this Q&A will now look like, I will just ask the person who wrote the question. I will introduce them and I'll ask them to pose the question themselves. So you can then unmute yourself, preferably have your camera on, so all the speakers will have a better feeling who's asking the question. So one question that was posed during Dave's presentation was from Andre. And Andre, actually, I would, except if you want me to pose the question, but I would now ask Andre to repeat his question in an audio form.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
My name is Andre Clemens, and I am an ex-energy activist. So my question was quite simple, and it's focused on the issue of premature shutdown of the thermal power plant in Schostein, the unit 6. That was finished about 10 years ago, and it's considered as one of the coal units with the highest efficiency in Europe. We say it's about 40%. So in the arguments about shutting down this unit that represents the largest but not the single operating unit in Slovenia, the argument was why to shut down one of those units in Europe that has the high efficiency ratio, and while in the other countries there will be still operating other units with far with lower efficiency. So I would like to have your statement or your opinion on that question.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, so
take that. Yeah, Dave, you go.
Thanks. So yeah, it's a really good question. When we look at the climate pathways going through and what they mean for coal generation, there was a really good analysis of the IPCC 1.5 degree scenarios by Climate Analytics that split it down by geography, and it's very clear that when you split that down, you need an 80% fall in coal generation by 2030, and what that means for all OECD countries is a complete phase out of coal for OECD countries, and then a global complete coal phase out for by 2040. And when you look at the IEA scenarios from yesterday, which is probably what stimulated your question from seeing the subcritical phase out by 2030, it's like, does that apply to efficient coal plants? Well, you've still got the output from efficient coal plants collapsing globally by 2030. So no one is anticipating the efficient coal plants can escape that, especially across Europe. If we look at what's happened in certain countries, it's worth highlighting. For example, you said Sostange is one of the most efficient, and there's 3 plants in the Netherlands that came on in the same year as that came online in 2015. Those plants are slightly more efficient, around low 40s, and the Dutch government, as part of their climate plan, announced a complete shutdown of coal by 2030. So these plants that will be like barely teenagers by the time 2030 comes around will have to shut in the same way that we would hope would apply for Sostange as well.
I would like to add one thing, if I may.
Go ahead.
So as you probably hear from my accent, I'm not originally Australian. I'm actually German, and I'm from Hamburg. And Hamburg had a long debate about a coal power plant called Moorburg, which is, if you translate it directly, it's called Swamp Castle. It's not a nice name, but So that has been built and came online 2015. Actually, almost exactly the month when I left to Australia, for Australia. Now, the debate is to shut it down. It's the most modern coal power plant in Europe, probably, very high efficient. The problem is nobody actually needs it. So it's overcapacity. Solar and wind comes in, and as Hamburg is close to the coast, there's more and more offshore wind coming in. It's simply a surplus. It's not really needed. So it's stranded asset. The interesting part is that everyone actually have told the local government, who desperately wanted to have a new coal power plant, that this is a stranded asset. So that was known 10 years ago and 5 years ago, but they went ahead anyway. So it was basically a matter of stupidity to build that coal power plant, while everyone actually knew that this is not needed. It was the original idea is like 10, 15 years old, and they thought, oh, if we phase out nuclear in Germany, we need new coal power plants. That was the original idea. They did not factor in the success of solar and wind. So they built the new coal power plant in the absence of a system analysis. And now it basically, it just backfires. I have to say that I actually believe in market forces. And if a utility is stupid enough to actually build a new coal power plant or a nuclear power plant, which is not economically viable, they have to be in charge for the stranded asset. It's basically their wrong business decision that they build that. You can argue, yes, but you know, we have here 40%, and somewhere in another country, there is an inefficient power plant. In theory, yes. In practice, no, because in practice, the electricity market is quite brutal. You actually use the electricity which is cheapest on the market, and that's not this electricity. Therefore, it's stranded asset. Too bad.
Sorry, Sven, just one short comment. It's not a market utility that builds this power plant. It's a corporation, state-owned, that owns the state, and this is the problem.
Well, then they did not handle the taxpayers' money very good.
It's of course the problem of the regional deployment, because this utility is employing together with coal mine about 1/3 of the population, and none of the plans for restructuring has been made in time. And now, when there is European money for restructuring of the area, we are lagging behind the plans, and this might be another reason why. Of course, I'm sure that under market conditions, this facility is incapable to survive. Yet there are still some instruments that can keep it alive even within the EU energy market.
Thank you.
Unfortunately.
Did you want to jump in, Sven?
No, I think that would be a whole new webinar in itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrei, for your question. Yes, we all know that the project Teske has become like a rather notorious failed project also within the EU. But we then, moving on, during Sven's presentations, there were a few more questions that came in. Matthias posed 2 questions, and perhaps they were already answered later on in the presentation, perhaps not. So I would invite Matthias, who is with us, to again introduce himself and pose his questions. I think we just got a new one from him as well just now. So Matthias, Are you with us? Matjaž? No. You have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. Otherwise, I'll just put the question.
Yeah, just read it because it's in the chat.
Yeah. I'll just read myself. So Matjaž said, first he said that by 2050, we need to halve total energy consumption. What does this mean for the share of electricity? Is there something else you would want to add to that question of his, besides what you've already explained?
That's easy to answer because electricity in most of the climate scenarios replaces fuels, and therefore we will have more than twice as much electricity, in some regions actually 4 times more electricity demand than today. So we will increase significantly electricity demand.
And then Matjaž, there was a question of clarification on his end while you were speaking, but I don't know to which slide this pertains exactly, but he asked if those are the costs on power or on production. Perhaps Matjaž, who is with us in the chat, can specify which slide he meant. Are those costs on power or production?
The LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, is the total generation cost, which includes the costs, sort of the investment cost, finance costs, and fuel costs, and everything. So it's basically full cost. How much, if you have the entire amount of money spent for a power plant divided through the amount of electricity you produce it, you get the levelized cost of electricity. So it is a fair comparison between the different technologies, because you take into account the different the generation amount. So for example, a nuclear power plant operates about 8,000 hours a year, while a solar power plant only 1,000. So that means in order to have the levelized cost of electricity, the installation cost per kilowatt must be significantly lower than, let's say, a coal or nuclear power plant in order to produce the same levelized cost of electricity, because you have only 1,000 hours to share the total cost, the total investment cost. So it actually reflects the operation time. So it's a fair comparison.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Before we go into one of the remarks that was posed actually before Matjaž posed his last question, I will actually just include Matjaž's latest question, because if he would have the microphone, he would just pose all the questions at once. So he just added, proponents of thermal power plants argue that renewables cannot ensure the stability of the electricity grid. Do we really need a nuclear power plant for this? I guess that relates to also what you were saying about the compatibility or incompatibility. Maybe
you need to have quite a bit of other system services. So frequency control, you need to some extent, they call it inertia, in order to have the frequency and sort of the quality of the electricity on a very high level. The good news is that you can actually do all the system services with a combination of solar inverters. So for example, a solar photovoltaic inverter controls the frequency in the grid before the electricity gets fed into the grid. So that means the solar, if it's a rooftop or a large scale, it's the same. Solar actually just checks to be sort of in the frequency of the grid, like 50 hertz or 60 hertz, depending on where you are. And then it actually feeds into the grid in the same frequency. And in order to feed in, they have to sort of synchronize. And that means that if you have lots of solar power plants, and it's measured the effect, you actually clean up the electricity grid, because in the old days, you had one power plant here, and then you have thousands of or millions of customers. So the electricity goes through the entire grid. Right now, you have the power plants are distributed across the entire grid. So you actually have more frequency control and harmonization in the power grid by a more distributed system. And that's actually measured. It's a measured effect. For example, here in Australia, 1/3, almost 30% of all households in Australia have their own solar PV on the rooftop. I mean, it's a no-brainer to do that here. We have twice as much sunshine hours as Europe. So we have seen that effect. Another effect is that, for example, wind power plants can deliver inertia for the stability, system stability. And there are possibilities that all these system services which you need for the electricity, for a good secure electricity supply, which is not just to have the right amount of kilowatt hour, there's a bit more. You can do that with batteries as well, or with other storage technologies. So to cut a long story short, no, you don't need a nuclear power plant or coal power plant as a backup. In fact, you actually can't use it as a backup because they're too slow.
Thank you, Sven. We had, I know there were two questions that piled on regarding the levelized costs, but I will actually now, just so we don't exclude people that posed the question just a bit before, I would ask, I know there was a remark or a remark/question from Andrei in the chat. So I would now ask Andrei to present himself and also pose his question or add his remark to the conversation. If you have a microphone and a camera, otherwise I can again read it out. Do we have Andrei with us? But you would have to unmute yourself so we can hear you. Okay, then I can just read out the remark question. Andrei, during Sven's presentation, wrote that solar are cheap is a false argument. The cost should include the cost of recycling, disposal, energy storage, daily and seasonal, and replacement energy facilities. Energy storage technology on large scale is currently not available. So I think that mostly relates to Sven. Andrei, do you have something to add? Okay, yes, I will try to unmute you myself.
Okay.
Yeah. Do we have, yeah, okay, we can hear Andrei.
Well, the point is that the cost has to include the storage and you know, you have daily variations and you have seasonal variations. So you need to ensure enough storage to cover these problems. I mean, for, let's say, IAE estimates that with 70% renewables, you have about 30 to 40% surplus of production at peak times. And one way of stabilizing the grid is, of course, to use excess energy for energy storage. So on the long term, of course, you can have renewables sustainable. But the point is that this requires massive deployment of, let's say, solar and wind, and you need energy to produce solar panels. You need energy to produce, let's say, batteries for storage, and you need to build replacement plants for the period. Let's say if we go to hydrogen economy, to run on hydrogen. When there is, during these seasonal changes, when there is no sun and no wind, for example. So I don't believe that the costs of these additional items are fully taken into account. And as for nuclear, there was a comment that the costs of decommissioning are underestimated. Well, that depends on what technology you're counting on, because you, of course, let's say with fourth generation nuclear power plants, you wouldn't have the problem of long-term storage because, I mean, you wouldn't have a big problem because what is now long-term waste, that's really fuel. That's not waste, but it's a problem of lack of development in nuclear technology, which has been stopped in most countries.
Thank you, Andre. I think that Dave and Sven have comments to this. So I will now let Sven take a break for a bit, and we'll go to Dave and then to Sven.
Thanks. It may be that we say similar things. I guess what I wanted to do with my presentation was to kind of show the journey that the world was on a little bit. So we said, oh, the world's got a tenth of its electricity from wind and solar so far this year. In some countries, it's a lot higher than that. In the countries that it's a lot higher than that, there's immense amount of innovation that's going on into how those levels of wind and solar get pushed up every day, and you enable that security of supply in the background. So apart from the fact that solar in itself it is falling in price every day. So I was putting in the chat an article from writing up from the World Energy Outlook today, and about the cost of solar and how cheap it is. There's that whole level of complementary technology which is developing day by day. So someone actually put in the question box of what's the cost to get to 100% renewables pathway. It's like, well, we don't know what the 100% cost is because we're nowhere close to that today. But over the next 10 years, the amount of innovation that go into that, I think will surprise most people. So just if you look through just what's happened in the last few months, you've started getting solar and battery auctions in Portugal and India, where it's not just that solar electricity that's being contracted, it's being contracted alongside battery. And a lot of that battery at the moment is lithium-ion battery. If you saw Tesla's battery day from last month, you'd see the innovations going on there about how quickly Tesla is halving the cost of battery and scaling up the technology, and obviously there's other companies in there as well, and also other technologies that make longer term storage more possible. The other thing that's happened really in the last couple of months is at a European Commission level, they've set out their hydrogen pathway, and as part of their hydrogen pathway, it's to build up 40 gigawatts of hydrogen electrolyzers by 2030 across the whole of Europe. And that will help take some of that excess solar out for really sunny days when you don't have the electricity demand. The Commission modeling for 2030 for 55% had 40 gigawatts of battery in there as well. So you can see the kind of scale of those building up. Stefan mentioned about how you physically keep the lights on around inertia in the UK. Our national grid has contracted for the equivalent of 5 coal power plants worth of balancing services that are dedicated balancing services, not provided from any electricity generation at all, just helping stabilize the grid. And there's all sorts of things going on day by day like that are building up, and it goes all the way down to potential changes that people are making around changing their electricity demand. So for example, Google have now changed the processing of a lot of their archiving processes that aren't time dependent, that they actually run when there is cheaper, cleaner electricity coming through as part of their mix. So there's a whole suite of technologies, some of which we know exist already, some of which we haven't even dreamt of, that will help us on that pathway and make all of this a lot more cheaper than we certainly thought it would ever have been a few years ago.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, Sven, if you can add, if you want to add something.
I can add a few things.
Yeah, before you go, we have 10 minutes left for the discussion, and I think 3 to 4 questions left that I would like us to address them. So maybe just have this in mind.
Yeah, very short and sharp. The costs include, obviously, the solar and wind cost include also the decommissioning cost for solar and wind, because it's mandatory. Our university, we are working a lot on recycling solar panels. So we have and batteries. So that's one of our main tasks, because Australia is exporting a lot of silicon and also lithium. Australia is one of the very few lithium producer, basically, mining. And there are a lot of battery factories under construction right now in Australia. So that's included. In terms of the energy content to produce solar PV, the energy payback time, so the amount of energy you put into a solar panel until you actually get that back, is about 1 year. In the 1970s, it was 30 years. 30 years. Right now, it's between 7 months and 1 year. Wind, the energy payback time for wind is around 5 to 8 months, depending on where you are. Again, in the 1980s, that was very high, not anymore. In terms of storage technologies, you don't actually need storage before you reach 30 to 40% solar and wind electricity combined. And then you need to actually have storage. But if you have a lot of electric mobility, you will have storage anyway, because the cars actually have electric batteries. So you don't need to wait for cheap batteries to start the renewables. But along the way, you need to build up demand side management facilities and storage facilities, which actually happens right now. Again, Australia has basically the grids are not all connected, because Australia is bigger than the entire EU, with a population of the Netherlands. So our grids are actually quite expanded, and some are not really connected. And we have 4 megawatt storage facilities already. So it's still small compared to the gigawatt, but we actually going there. But you don't need to have that in order to start. And I did not have it in my presentation, but if you go to the Lazar website, you see that battery costs, even if you include battery costs, solar PV is still significantly cheaper than nuclear.
Thank you, Sven. Actually, I would just, we have 3 questions left, and before giving the floor to Luca for his question, there were 2 questions, I guess, that were questions still of clarification related to levelized costs of electricity. One was by Borut and one by Matjaž. If Borut and Matjaž don't mind, I'll just read them out myself, so we kind of speed up, because they were like questions of clarification. Borut asked whether levelized costs for solar includes batteries and smart grids. It needs to work. And Matjaž asked whether does the estimated cost of the nuclear power plant include the cost of storing nuclear waste. So whether the costs on the solar part include batteries and smart grids that it needs to work. And then for the nuclear, the costs for the nuclear power plant, whether they include the costs of nuclear waste storage.
It's short, very short. But levelized cost of electricity is the generation cost, not the system cost. System costs are not included in any case, but you know the storage cost for nuclear waste is also not included in the LCOE, which blows up that significantly. So system costs are not generation costs, and therefore not included in the LCOE.
Thank you. I would now invite Luca, if he's willing and able to pose his question himself. You would need to unmute yourself and preferably turn on the camera.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Katja?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So the argument within our local Slovenian context goes, while building a new nuclear might not be economically viable, what about extending the lifespan of the existing one until, let's say, 2050? Is there any difference between, in general, is there any difference between extending the lifespan or building the new one within the scope of your analysis? Thank you.
I mean, in terms of costs, well, operating an old one longer, if it does not explode, then it's probably cheaper. If it goes off, then it's more expensive. As you see in Fukushima, it's really expensive because you can't actually live in that country anymore. Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that question. I don't know at what state the nuclear power plant is, and if it will survive another 30 years.
I think that when you look at normal life extensions on nuclear, certainly in the permitting in the UK, it's kind of done on a 5-year at a time basis. So you're reviewing that in 5 years' time. It extends the permit in 5 years' time. So I think that the question between is expanding it over 5 to 15 years. Maybe a relatively cheap one, but if you're looking to extend it over a much longer period of time, you'd have to do a complete overhaul of the power plant and basically be rebuilding that power plant.
I think this will be maybe a very good question for our next speaker as well, Ben Wheeler, who's focusing on economics of nuclear power plants and related also to decommissioning. And I'm sure that he's following the developments related to lifetime extensions in Europe as well. So Luca, if you'll be with us or you won't be with us for the next session, I propose we also pose this question to Ben. If that is okay with you.
So sorry, I will need to go, but
we can.
I'll follow the debate later.
we'll keep it in mind and we'll pose it to Ben as well, because I think it's actually right up his alley, and we'll let you know later the answer as well. Now I think we have 3 minutes, but we received one question on Facebook in the discussion. And Dave actually already mentioned it, but maybe we can just address it again. So there was a question on Facebook that said, how much would 100% renewable grid cost?
Well, I mean, that depends on where you are. If you, let's say, if you're like Slovenia, I never did the analysis of the Slovenian grid, obviously. I would say I could answer it for Germany because I'm originally German, and I could answer it for Australia because now I'm in Australia. So in Germany, the grid expansion is sort of grid maintenance is ongoing in any case. So there's in Germany about 2 billion euros are invested in operation and maintenance of the grids every year. So it is pretty hard to quantify in order to say how much does it cost, because you actually have an electricity grid already, and that means you step by step decrease capacity of coal and nuclear, and you increase of renewables. You need to have additional grids in some extent, but then on the other hand, you actually save also fuel costs. So the answer is the system costs, and there are some analysis of systems. The system costs, so including the system plus generation, will actually not increase, but also will not decrease a lot. But it will be sort of within the same order of magnitude. But it's a very difficult question. Because the truth is different in each region, depending on the state of the grid. Australia, for example, has a huge or had overcapacities in the grid. So before Australia needs to expand, we actually have some time. So we don't really need to build the grid or expand the grid parallel to more and more capacity. We need to do that in a few years' time, but not now. So there is no clear answer. It's all the analysis I've seen is that system costs are more or less the same. in both systems.
Thank you, Sven. Would you like to add anything, Dave? Perhaps in your end, this is
No, not more than before, really. Which is just to
Okay.
say that this is a work in progress, and we know that just to be very bullish on all those like the technologies coming along and what's happening. So that when we're trying to visualize it today, we don't quite know what it's going to look like, but I'm sure that we'll all be pleasantly surprised, and this will be a lot easier than and cheaper than we think it is today.
Well, on that note, the positivity coming from London, I think, we will end the first bit of today's conference. So thank you to Dave and Sven. Thanks to all of you that have been with us so far, and thank you for the questions, the remarks. We have, because we've been going now without a pause, full throttle, we'll take a 20-minute break, and we'll be back 10 minutes past 11, and we'll be joined by Ben Wheeler from the German Institute for Economic Research, and his presentation will actually be more focused on the economics of nuclear power plants. He'll be reviewing recent trends and analyzing future investments. So I hope you can all join us in 20 minutes. Yes, so see you in a bit.